30% of your power bill goes to BPA, who is misusing your funds. You're paying part of your taxes to fish mitigation efforts that aren't working as well, and you're not getting your industry back. We are triple screwing these people. And Idaho leaders are like, no, I don't want to. I mean, nobody wants to touch it because it's a political nightmare. Why were the dams created in the first place? Well, they were built so the number of dams, including the lowest dam in the bottom, Bonneville Dam, and a number of dams were built over the years, and it started with the New Deal, FDR's New Deal. And in that New Deal was created the Bonneville Power Administration. The Bonneville Power Administration, in the haste of getting the U.S. economy out from under itself, excuse me, they did not give it congressional oversight. They have one administrator. And unlike a very similar sort of government monopoly bureaucracy called the Tennessee Valley Authority, which generates power over in the east, but they have a congressional oversight committee explicitly dedicated to them. Bonneville Power doesn't have that. They just have an administrator. Their sort of directive was to create at-cost power for citizens of the Pacific Northwest. And during the New Deal, World War II is coming down the pipeline, they were given the directive just like make power, because we needed to power aluminum smelters to build aircraft. And so this is a war effort thing. And I think it's important context, because a lot of people will think of FDR as a socialist and the New Deal as a socialist program. And as we have these relics of the New Deal and FDR's socialist ideals, we have very conservative Republicans defending them now, which is just, I think, an ironic and interesting thing. So, but just keep that in your back pocket. So BPA, over their history, has built 31 power generating projects, mostly hydro, up and down the Columbia River Basin. There's 4 on the Columbia, but for Idaho's fish, let's just focus on the Columbia, where our fish go. They come in, first they start in Idaho and they go out towards the ocean, and then they come back to Idaho. But the dams they come in contact with are 4 on the lower Columbia. And I don't know all of their names off the hand, but and then there's 4 on the Snake River. There's other dams on like the Yakima and elsewhere. And then there's also they also have a proliferation of wind and solar, and they have nuclear, Hanford. And so it's diversified somewhat. But in the 1940s, when they were planning to build the 4 Snake River dams, we had salmon and steelhead, and salmon and steelhead were still making it through the lower 4 Columbia dams because we had fish ladders. And the Fish and Wildlife Service and Department of Fish and Game of Idaho and the other state wildlife agencies basically said, this is going to destroy Snake River fish. And they were right. They said, we had a salmon cannery in Lewiston, the town of Lewiston. It's no longer there, obviously, but this was a commercially, not just recreationally viable industry. So, they said this, and what they said was going to happen came to fruition. The Army Corps actually built the dams, not BPA. BPA just kind of planned like the power selling markets and transmission. The Army Corps said, and this moniker still exists to this day, that the amount of shipping that these dams would create a shipping port that would get ships all the way from Lewiston to the Pacific Ocean. They wanted to create this like big, like, look at this, a seaport all the way in Idaho. Hurrah. Like, is that even a good idea? Who knows? But the amount of boats that would go through the locks as compared to rivers like the Mississippi, which is a huge transportation corridor. They actually referred to the Snake River dams as a river corridor of minimal use. Like, it's still to this day so minimally used that like the Army Corps is just like negligible. They call it negligible use. So that's just important because people are like, God, these things are so important for shipping. The Army Corps doesn't think so, and they didn't think so before they built them. They're still called a waterway of negligible use. So that's just important to know. But we started building these power plants, and by the time the 70s roll around, we've built the last of the 4 Snake River dams. Right away, there's a drop in fish returns. But at the same time, is this thing happened that's referred to as WHOOPS. And it's an acronym that's basically the Washington power supply thing. And I forget exactly what it is, but what happened was BPA wildly over forecasted how much power could be consumed by the Pacific Northwest. And when you have a glut of supply with not enough demand, that's like not great economics. And so Congress had to step in and pass the Northwest Power and Supply Act of Northwest Power Act of 1980. And that restructured BPA. And that's important because it has implications of it's what created this massive Gordian knot that has spread BPA's tentacles, and this is a federal agency, has just spread its tentacles all over the Pacific Northwest. And what it did was it said, okay, BPA, with the power that can't be consumed within the Northwest, you're going to build transmission lines to places like California, other markets, and you're going to sell that power. And the money you make on selling that power is going to be rebated to citizens in the Pacific Northwest, and it's going to pay for fish and wildlife mitigation efforts for the problems that you're causing salmon and steelhead. So if you're a BPA customer, what that means today is if you're a BPA customer, mostly North Idaho, we get some of it. Idaho Power down here kind of trades a little bit with BPA when they need power and vice versa. But if you're a BPA customer, 30% of your power bill is paying for fish recovery efforts. If you're a taxpayer, you're also supplementing fish recovery efforts through NOAA and other federal agencies. So we spend about $1 billion. It's like 900 million to $1 billion on fish recovery efforts for Idaho's salmon and steelhead to no avail. We've spent $26 billion with a B dollars through ratepayer dollars and taxpayer dollars, the most expensive species recovery effort in world history. Let me say that again. $26 billion, the most expensive species recovery effort in world history, to no avail. We have no more fish to show for it than when we started doing this in the 90s. So when people say, we're looking for ways to untie this knot, and they are like, nope, not that, not that. I usually ask them, what's your idea? Because we're bleeding money right now. This is not sustainable. Not only are we paying for it, but we're also robbing Idaho's rural communities of an industry, a real viable industry. And so if you live in Orofino, 30% of your power bill goes to BPA, who is misusing your funds. You're paying part of your taxes to fish mitigation efforts that aren't working as well, and you're not getting your industry back. We are triple screwing these people. And Idaho leaders are like, no, I don't want to. I mean, nobody wants to touch it because it's a political nightmare. But like that's the stage that we have right now. Okay, so that is not, it's just not sustainable. So that's the kind of outlook right now. Over the years, since about 2000, the people that we were selling that surplus power to, mostly California, have onlined their own power supply system. They're now doing a lot of wind and solar, and I know a lot of people there's political connotations with wind and solar, but like I'm on the ground, like I'm not interested in people's partisan like beliefs about power. If your light turns on, no, people don't care really where it comes from. They don't even think about it. But again, there's like this theory that like wind and solar isn't viable. It's getting very, very cheap now. And coupled with battery storage, so when people don't need it, but the wind's blowing, we're at least keeping that energy somewhere that can be used when the wind is not blowing. And it's a real thing that is happening. And that's not hypothetical. Elliot Manzer is a guy who was the former administrator of the Bonneville Power Administration. He left to work for an energy company in California called like the California Independent Service Provider something. I forget the acronym. They have created 6,000 to 8,000 megawatts of storage with onlining new power generation. And it's being lauded as like one of the most like innovative power generation portfolios. It's diversified. They're upgrading the grid. I mean, to say that we can't produce the power that the dams provide is just like woefully like an uneducated statement. So let's get into like the power really quick. The dams, we hear this a lot. There was a congressional hearing the other day, and Congressman Fulcher said that the dams produce 3,500 megawatts of power. That's not even true, which is upsetting because, like I said before, his constituents are paying 3 times over and they're not getting their fish back. And he doesn't even have the facts right to like look at this issue with a critical eye. The dams have a nameplate capacity of 3,500 megawatts. What that means is if we had the water supply behind them and we were pushing water out at 100% night and day, they could produce 35. They have the engine power to make 3,500, but because of water supply and because these are run of river dams, they don't store water. We've never gotten there. On average, and these receipts exist. Over the last 15 years, they've produced 950 megawatts of power. So let's just call it 1,000. That's very, very replaceable. The problem with those specific 1,000 megawatts, and they are valuable when, especially during peak demand times of the year. So mostly in December and January when people are turning on their heaters, and the other times of the year, which actually requires more demand, is July and August when people are turning on their ACs. If the power supply system that Bonneville has needs peak power, like most of the time, those dams aren't even producing power. But when people all of a sudden need to turn their ACs on and they need baseload power that's reliable, they'll flip a switch on the dams. That water acts as sort of a battery, but because these dams don't provide storage, they only have about 12 hours of battery, which is not that much, okay? Like, that's what people need to kind of understand. And during those times, and that's why I mentioned those times of the year is important, December and January, July and August, that happens to be when they had the highest demand. That happens to be when we have the lowest supply of water. There's no, and the reason BPA's history is important because a lot of these dams were built with predictable snowfall and melt regimes in the 1920s. That is not the case anymore. Most of our snowpack is melting in like 1 month. And that happens to be in like May when we don't need the power. So when the dams have the potential to produce the power, no one's using it. And it's sold at a loss. It is sold at a loss. So when people say, if Bonneville Power was a private entity, they would have gone bankrupt years ago. So defending this bloated federal runaway bureaucracy is like unconscionable to me, and especially if someone calls himself a conservative, because the private energy producers that compete with Bonneville are producing energy at half the cost, and they're not killing our fish. It's indefensible. And Bonneville is so arrogant that the previous administrator, and the reason I brought him up aside from that point, is that he, during his work with the federal government as administrator of Bonneville Power, said, yeah, it's just not politically feasible to build 1,000 megawatts in the storage. And yet then he quits and goes to a private operator in California and builds like 10 times what he said wasn't capable of Bonneville Power. So the reason what's holding us back is just bureaucracy and politics. So that's the power thing. It's important to paint a picture that throughout the year, when demand is high but it can't produce power, and then when supply is high but there's no demand, we are losing money. And that's the power side of things. We can replace that with better power generation. However, there's one more service remaining, and it's valuable as well. I should say it's valuable to a certain industry, but it's diminishing. It's the transportation. The dams create a series of slackwater reservoirs, and they're deep enough to allow barging to take place. A number of barging transportation services have simply been eliminated over the years. In 2000, that was like the peak of barging through the lower Snake River dams. We used to send products up, and they're called 20-foot equivalent units. Think of like train car stuff that they're like loaded on barges. They're picked up, put on trains. Those containers used to get like goods shipped up the river and shipped down river. That's done. Portland doesn't have, which is like the last port down on the Columbia River. They don't even ship those anymore. Like, it's not coming back. That was like, we used to get like 18,000 containerized shipments a year. Done. That's not coming back. The remaining shipment that uses that river is wheat, and it's all downriver, right? So boats come up, and then boats do come up delivering things like windmill blades and some other weird stuff like that. But like, business is so bad for the Port of Lewiston that like, well, 30% of their revenue is city of Lewiston taxpayers. It's just a subsidy. They give 30% of the port their revenue because they can't make it as a business. And then the other like significant portion of the port's income, because they're not receiving what they were designed to receive, which is like imports and exports, is they're a business incubator. Like all of the vacant space on the port is literally for like new startup businesses that just pay lease for the ground property. So like, yeah, it's insane. And the Port of Lewiston, like everyone's like, we got to save the port. Guess how many people they employ?
I wouldn't even, I was going to say a dozen.
7 people. So to say that this is like, it will destroy the port. I mean, my God, we'll have more than 7 people, like guides and outfitters, that'll move to community if we have that many fish back. I mean, but it's insane. I mean, like, right. So I'm like this, and this is all real. The containerized shipping, the amount of boats that go through the barges, anybody can find this information on the Port of Lewiston's website. They have a database query interface. You can get these numbers on your own. And the Bonneville power, the wattage, all that stuff, it's all publicly available. And the amount of money we spend on fish and wildlife programs through our rates and through our taxes, it's all publicly available. So the shipping is declining. But why is the shipping declining? Someone asked me like, well, that was COVID. It's like, no, it was about 2017 is when things bottomed out. The reason is, like I said, there's no more containerized shipping that's being done by truck and rail. Rail infrastructure already exists up there. In fact, when I was the first few months of the Governor Salmon work group, we met up in Lewiston, and there was a huge mountain of grain next to the river because nobody could ship through the dams because there was a crack in Bonneville Dam, the lowest one on the system. While they were fixing it, there was no river traffic. They just had to move it to the trains, and they were shipping it that way. And so it's like the infrastructure is already there. But why is shipping, aside from the containerized stuff, but it's dropping because the free market is abandoning the river. Towns like Rosalia, Washington, which is on the Idaho-Washington, north of the dams, but like on the Idaho-Washington border, Rosalia is like a couple hundred people. They built their own rail line and grain terminal co-op. The farmers own the co-op, so they dictate their own prices. They built it on their own. It was like a public-private like loan partnership, whatever. Sure. They're never going back to the river. A town of 200 people are like, screw the river. Like, we're tired of like the dams breaking down, us not being able to get our stuff to the river. We're tired of being gouged by the barging companies. We're directing our own future, just like the tribes are. And that's happening all over the place. And the train, before the dams were built, I mean, there was a train that goes all the way to Grangeville, Idaho, where we could, the grain and other products were put on there. It still exists. You could just flip that thing back on. It would take some renovations, but like, Congressman Mike Simpson has offered to pay for those renovations so that we don't need to rely on the dam. So like the infrastructure is already there. Some of it around, the Northwest might need some upgrades, but like that's like the cheapest component of this whole thing is upgrading the transportation. So towns, grain growers are taking their future into their own hands, and they're abandoning the Snake River. All the while, the federal government is trying to prop up this like dam system, and people are the free market is speaking. They're leaving it behind. And so that's another thing that's kind of unconscionable to me. People that think that they're fiscal responsible, like they're fiscal conservatives, they're defending, when they defend the dams, this outdated and dwindling like value federal bureaucracy that's just destroying things, and it's more expensive. While the free market is like, I mean, it's like, you know what I mean? Like, you see like why that's it's so frustrating.
Oh, listen, man.
Yeah.
I'm listening to absolutely everything you're saying. The several points. People don't realize that Idaho itself is one of the largest producers of green energy, and the energy just gets shipped out. And by the way, it's getting shipped out now at a loss. So Idaho citizens who like their tax dollars are getting hosed. We have solutions to these problems. And that's one of the biggest frustrations, I think, that, again, the people I've been talking to over the last several months, sort of like, this is not a politicized thing, right? Like if you need electricity, we can get you electricity, right? That's not a political problem. But the politics involved around actually coming up and engaging a functional solution are the things. And again, not even like imagining a functional solution. It's like, no, there are solutions right here. They're like, no, well, we can't do that.
Yeah.
And it has nothing to do with the functionality of it. That's like old school creepy politics. You know, I mean, kind of the exact opposite of what we were talking about at the beginning of like, hey, Idaho seems to be a state that really has a degree of self-determination and just giddy up and go, right? Like, let's find a solution for these problems and make them happen. But then understanding how entrenched certain agencies are and how strongly they hold on to legacy assumptions and practices to the detriment of the communities. It's really unfortunate.
Oh my God. But here's the thing. One of the things that taxpayers pay for is dredging the river channel. So even though we have the reservoirs, which is supposed to make it so the water line allows for boats to come through, you still need to dredge it because the silt builds up. Taxpayers fund that, not the barging industry, who benefits from it. So there was a bill years ago and I forget, the guy is probably not even alive anymore, but it was basically a bill that would make it so the bargers would pay for the maintenance of the river channel because they're the ones using it, right? They flipped their lid. The barging industry lobbied so hard. They killed it. And so like the remaining people who like don't want like the benefit from the dam's existence, one, they benefit on the backs of taxpayers and ratepayers. They're riding the gravy train with biscuit wheels. Like, why would they want to let go of this like sweet government cheese, right? Like, so, but like it's hurting everybody else. So